This is Queens Boulevard in 1900, and this is Queens Boulevard today. This is Houston Street in the 1920s, and this is Houston Street today. This is Sullivan Street in 1921, and this is Sullivan Street today. As you can see, all three of these roads have been widened at one point. But why? If you look a little deeper, like literally, you will see that there are subway lines running at or nearby. Queens Boulevard has the Queens Boulevard line, Houston Street has the 6th Avenue line, and Sullivan Street has a nearby 8th Avenue line. But when you look a little deeper, you will notice that they're all built by the same company, the Independent Subway System, or IND. So, what happened? Is there a connection between roads and the IND? And why is there a connection between two of the most polar opposite forms of transportation in New York City? The New York City Subway used to have three separate subway companies: the Interborough Rapid Transit Company, or IRT, the Brooklyn Rapid Transit Company, or BRT, and the Independent Subway System, or IND. And let's zoom into the IND, as the IND was extremely different from both the IRT and BRT. Unlike the IRT and BRT, the IND was designed as this grander subway system, and no expense was wasted. Long express runs, long mezzanines, and full grade separation were baked into the IND's design. And they needed to do that, as the IND was mandated to make a profit within 3 years. So, a good way of doing that is to build a new shiny subway right next to or under old, overcrowded, and dirty elevated train lines. You see, Highland wasn't alone in not liking the IRT and BRT. The elevated trains were viewed as loud and outdated by just about everyone, and everyone wanted them gone. But when the IND was being designed, a new form of transportation started to take over American streets: cars. By the 1920s, the car became much cheaper and people were buying them, and that caused a lot of traffic. So city planning began to shift to also building more roads. In 1927, the first underwater roadway under the Hudson River, called the Holland Tunnel, opened. This was exclusively for cars, and proved to be immensely popular. In fact, when the Great Depression hit, causing transit ridership to go down, traffic in the Holland Tunnel only increased. But in New York City, even with the Great Depression, the subway was still the premier mode of getting people around. And with congestion on the subways still at an all-time high, planners came up with a solution: build a subway, and then use the roof of the subway for a new road. You see, cut and cover was the primary way subway lines were constructed, but it was pretty disruptive. And with the many 4-track trunk lines that the IND wanted to build, it was extra disruptive. This meant a wider path was needed, meaning a wider road came as a result. Since more roads was what the planners wanted, that is what ended up happening. It should also be noted that the same tactic was used during the dual contracts era of the New York City Subway, as both the BRT and IRT used trains for roads. For example, the path underneath the Flushing line became Roosevelt Avenue. 7th Avenue was extended in part thanks to the 7th Avenue Subway, but the IND was unique because of how disruptive it was, and how almost every line it designed brought more roads. In 1929, the IND Second System was proposed. In the plan, a ton of subways were proposed because obviously it was the IND. But that was only half of the story. The other half was roads. Lots and lots of roads. And the subways would be the greatest facilitator. For example, the IND South 4th Street line was one of the crown jewels of the project. Yet South 4th Street itself was extremely narrow and ended early in Williamsburg. In other words, not the best place for a 6-track subway line. But no problem. The IND would have bulldozed the entirety of not just the homes around South 4th Street, but also extended South 4th Street for another mile. Street won't be an appropriate designation for this new path. Boulevard would. And it wasn't just South 4th Street. The Utica Avenue subway was another plan in the IND Second System, consisting of 4 tracks. But what most people don't realize is in some places, Utica Avenue isn't wide enough for a 4-track line. And it is not just Utica Avenue. Malcolm X Boulevard and Stuyvesant Avenue were only 35 feet wide. Yet the minimum width of a 4-track line that I could find was 45 feet. This means that either Malcolm X Boulevard or Stuyvesant Avenue needed to be widened in order for the Utica Avenue Subway to be built. Finally, let's talk about the IND Burke Avenue line, or today's IND Concourse extension. When the IND opened the IND Concourse line in 1933, Norwood wasn't supposed to be the end of the line. Rather, it was supposed to be extended to Baychester Avenue in the northeastern Bronx. However, there was a problem. Burke Avenue doesn't exist in Norwood. In fact, there was an entire river that separates them. But the IND said, no problem. Let's build a bridge for the D train so that it can service the new line. But the train wasn't the only thing that the bridge would service. Cars would also use the new bridge. The upper level was for cars using the new Burke Avenue Bridge, and the lower level would be for the new trains. The IND dreamed big, and unfortunately for them, 1929 was also when the Great Depression hit. The Great Depression put a brake on all of those plans, as the IND could barely scrape enough money to finish the IND First System. But in 1932 and 34, two things happened. FDR won in 1932 to be president, and LaGuardia won in 1934 to be mayor of New York City. FDR and LaGuardia developed a close relationship, and because of that relationship, the WPA gave 20% of its entire budget to New York City. And New York City made good use of that money, finally opening the rest of the IND First System. And with the IND First System almost complete, planners re-released the IND Second System in 1939. And again, it wasn't just a subways package, but also a roads package too. The IND South 4th Street was still on the table. So was the Utica Avenue Subway, and so was the IND Concourse extension. And every one of its roads would again be still on the table. But the IND Second System was delayed in 1941, with the US entry into World War II. And after the war, attention was shifted towards new roads. LaGuardia stepped down in 1946, and his status as the person who had a direct line to the federal government went with it. That status went to Robert Moses, who quickly used it to get more money for more roads. Moses decided to cut out the subways as the middleman and propose straight up new roads. He originally did it with the Grand Central Parkway, and now he was going to do it all again, and it would start in the Bronx and Queens. In 1948, the Cross Bronx Expressway was built. In 1949, the Van Wyck Expressway was built. These two expressways resulted in the destruction of thousands of homes, most of them African American. But what many people didn't realize was how the IND had a bit of overlap. The 8th Avenue line cut through Harlem and Midtown West, two neighborhoods that were redlined. The Culver line went through Cobble Hill and Carroll Gardens, which were also redlined. And it wasn't just the present IND, but the future IND. Once again, the South 4th Street Subway and Utica Avenue lines would have gone through Bedford-Stuyvesant, a red-line neighborhood. And the IND Concourse extension would have gone through the northeastern Bronx, which was also redlined. But correlation does not equal causation, and it was hard trying to pinpoint the IND being exactly in the mold of Moses. For example, the Fair Housing Act of 1934, which caused redlining, didn't exist when the IND was proposed. Most IND roads, despite it being really wide, were exactly on the same scale of destruction as a typical expressway. The IND was slated to replace the elevated train lines, which ran in the oldest neighborhoods of New York City, and the oldest neighborhoods of New York City were the ones that got redlined. So yes, the IND had overlap with Moses, but it is pretty hard to prove causation here. Today, we view trains as something that will bring neighborhoods together. And that is definitely a true statement, as neighborhoods with transit access are more likely to be dense, vibrant communities. But for a time in New York City, that was the opposite. The IND was envisioned as the modern way, where suburbia and wide roads would develop around it. But that was a historical mistake, because the removal of elevateds did not rejuvenate neighborhoods. It made those neighborhoods much worse. Anyways, this marked the end of this video. What are your thoughts? Tell us in the comments section below. And if you enjoyed this video, consider liking and subscribing. And I'll see you in the next video.